just like Christmas.
This project is made from old oak pallet boards, so the first step is cleaning them up at the planer and then over at the table saw, squaring up one edge. These boards are double the thickness needed, so I take 2 shallow passes at the table saw to cut about 80% through and finish the resawing over at the bandsaw. This is a way safer operation than making the full cut with the table saw. I then get my 3 sets of boards set up in some clamps as I apply glue along one edge. These were left in the clamps overnight to dry. Once dry, I run the gnarly side through the planer to even the top face out, and then a light pass on the bottom to remove the glue squeeze out and bring the boards to final thickness. Over at the table saw, I joint one edge, and then at the miter saw flush up one end and then cut to rough length. I set my calipers to match the prints, and then back at the table saw I rip the boards to final width. I then measure the exact thickness of the 1/4 inch plywood and set the fence to create the bottom rabbet to house the actually 18 thou thick plywood bottom. I move the fence to finish the rabbet cut without having to install a sacrificial fence. I then measure and set my fence to establish the outside dimension of the upper dado groove. The dado is nibbled away with several passes instead of installing a dado stack, as this allows me to be lazy, but also maintain a constant blade height between rabbets and dados. I will also mention that I'm using a full curve flat tooth blade to leave a silky smooth finish. At the miter saw, I have a sacrificial fence installed to give me 0 clearance and reduce the blowout on the back as I cut the miters to length. To get the measurements of the top and bottom panel, I dry fit the box and cut the panels to size first at the table saw and then the miter saw to final length. I then took the top panel to my homemade CNC to engrave the power grid box art. This step is totally optional, but one option if you want something on the front and don't have a CNC is to try a photo transfer using acetone, but that's up to you to experiment with. Once complete, I take the hold downs out and give the panel a light sanding to remove the fuzzies. Now on to final assembly. I apply glue to the top edge of the dado as well as the mitered corners. Before adding the last 2 sides, I slide in the top panel, making sure to have that sweet logo facing out. The other 2 sides are stood up and a corner band clamp is added to hold everything together. Every woodworker should have at least one of these clamps, as they aren't used all the time, but they're pretty cheap and you will be so happy you have one when you need it. I used a chisel and some Kleenex to scrape the excess glue out and then put a bunch of weight in the box facing down to act as a clamp and let the glue dry overnight. I then removed the weights and applied glue to the bottom rabbet and fitted the bottom panel to dry overnight. Again, weight was added on top to act as a clamp. At this point it's a box and would be fine just to cut the lid off, but I wanted to jazz it up and at the same time strengthen the corners. So what I'm doing next is building a simple jig to hold the box at a 45-degree angle over a dovetailed router bit set up at my router table. The bottom is a piece of 1/8 inch hardboard, the triangle gussets are 3/4 inch plywood, the part that contacts the box is 5/8 inch MDF, and the back is 1/4 inch hardboard. All of this is scrap wood and can be made out of anything really. I chose to use only wood glue, no fasteners, as I didn't want to risk hitting any with the router bit. The glue only construction is very strong, but is a little bit fiddly during assembly. I measured for square and it was slightly out, so I added a clamp to bring it into square, and as the glue dried on the side, it locked its shape in place. Over at the router table, I have my dovetail bit installed at the correct height, and plunged into the jig on the outside, and began cutting my way into the center. Once enough material is carved out, I set my fence stop blocks to make a no-thinking operation to cut the 8 top and bottom dovetails. Once complete, I move the fence back to the center of the jig and cut away the relief material before again setting up my stop blocks. The middle 4 tails are then cut, making sure I keep the jig pressed up against the fence. I then run some scrap walnut through the planer to make it flat and sparkly. Then at the table saw, I joint an edge and cut off a couple thin strips. My blade is then tilted to 14 degrees to match the dovetail router bit, and I can make my first pass to cut the strips in half, and then set the fence to cut all 4 strips to the exact same size as the dovetails. At the bandsaw, I cut the strips down to small bite-sized pieces and knock off the fuzzy edges at my homemade strip sander. Now onto installing the Ducktail splines, I first brush on a whack of glue to the box, then roll the walnut pieces in glue to ensure every surface has adequate coverage. These were all a pretty tight fit, which is what you want, but in some instances, a persuader was required to motivate the walnut to become more than friends with the oak. Once dry overnight, I removed the bulk of the waste at the bandsaw. I was concerned about eating into the side of the box accidentally, so I left more than I should have from the bandsaw. So I then went back to my homemade strip sander to take more material off quickly. Finally, I used a random orbit sander to flush up the tails and leave them silky smooth. With my thin kerf blade installed at my table saw, I make 4 passes to separate the lid from the bottom. This was my first time ever doing this and was slightly nerve-wracking, but with confidence in your hands and the ability to keep the material stable, it's no big deal. Just remember the last cut lets the lid go free, so don't let go. Lastly for the box was to give everything its final sanding through the grit, stopping at 240 grit. I made sure to break all the hard edges with some hand sanding as well. Next I cut up some scrap 5/8 inch MDF at the table saw and drench one face in glue. I used a plastic case to spread the glue evenly and slap the other board on top. I added 5 million clamps and let it dry overnight. This is going to be the game parts divider and serve double duty as holding the lid in place. I then bring my MDF Nightmare over to my homemade CNC machine and run the code to cut out the interior pockets. I measured all the game pieces, leaving about 1/4 inch of extra room around each part, as well as some finger cutouts to help remove game pieces. If you haven't built my CNC yet, which you should because it's awesome and free plans are available on my website diybuilds.ca, you can make a template and freehand route out the pockets, or even just make a bunch of strips of wood and glue them onto a backer board to create little fences. But I have a CNC, so I like this method. Now that the CNCing is complete, I bring it to my table saw to trim it to final width. The width is based on measurements taken from the assembled box itself and not my plans, since some error could have been introduced. It's then cut to length at the miter saw in the same fashion. After the final sanding and blowing off everything with compressed air outside, I lay the pieces out and apply a spray lacquer finish. I was able to apply 5 coats within an hour to front and back. I then brush on some flocking glue, which is color matched to the flocking powder being used. It should be applied on thick and on a sealed surface. Once the insides are all coated, I immediately start blasting the flocking onto the surfaces, adding way more than needed. That's okay, because the excess is just shaken off back into the storage bag once it's cured. And with that, the project is complete.
I'd buy this for $1.